Hey everyone, Isaac here. So first off, if you are the kind of person that prefers to read written text rather than watch videos or listen to audio, I have a link down in the description to my blog that has this entire video in the form of a blog post. That being said, let's get into the meat of this topic. A lot of people are really interested to find out what it's like to be autistic, but they don't want to ask an autistic person about their disposition for fear of offending them. I can totally understand that fear because a lot of people with various disorders are uncomfortable talking about something so personal to them, and people who are curious will refrain from asking because they don't want to put someone in an awkward position. As the title suggests, I am autistic. I'm pretty open about myself, and I want to tell everyone about what it's like to help the world better understand people with autism. I think anyone that's ever lived wonders what it's like to be a variety of different people other than themselves or have a disposition other than their own. The reason for such curiosity is, of course, because a single individual's experience, my life, your life, my mom's life, is only a microcosm on a huge planet filled with 7.5 billion people. Yet your single life is all you have and all you will ever have, so it's totally irrational to wonder about being someone completely different than you are. You've probably heard the phrase, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. This statement is correct. Every autist is an individual in the same way that everyone is an individual. However, even for those of us who fall under the mild autism diagnosis typically associated with the higher functioning end of the spectrum, we tend to exhibit similar symptoms and face similar challenges throughout our lives. I'd like to offer two preemptive disclaimers. I am talking about people who would fall under the high-functioning or mild umbrella. Temple Grandin loves to mention that autism is a diagnosis which can range from half the people working in Silicon Valley to someone who remains nonverbal and can't dress themselves for their entire life. I am obviously not speaking for severely autistic people because I am an adult who has no problem with any aspects of adult functioning. If you want a perspective on severe autism, I'd recommend Carly Fleischmann, a severely autistic girl who communicates through typing on computers. My second disclaimer is about the term neurotypical, as a lot of people are not familiar with that term. It's meant to denote someone who does not have autism or any other significant neurological differences such as Down syndrome, intellectual disabilities, etc. I think the best way to go about explaining what it's like to be autistic is to explain how our experience differs from most people's experience. Something that a lot of people don't seem to understand is that in so many ways, autistic people are not that far removed from the rest of the population. We're human. Just like any other humans, we have emotions, we have ambitions, and we have normal relationships with other people. It's not that hard to find an autistic person with a career, a spouse, and children who barbecues with the neighbors on Saturday nights and takes the church pew with everyone else the next morning. That being said, even though many of us might have normal lives, the way that we see and experience the world is different. A common but accurate metaphor describing us is that we're running on a different operating system. We are Windows computers running in a world designed by and made for Macs. Such a difference gives us a completely different perspective on life. Our cognition and the manner in which we think is with extreme depth. Deep thinking obviously isn't exclusive to autistic people, but you're not going to find an autistic person whose thought process isn't incredibly detailed. Many of us have a relatable experience of overthinking things. It's true, there's a lot going on in our heads. Lots of autistic people talk about how we seem to have this whole world existing entirely in our minds. There's a post that's been circulating the internet ever since I've been browsing the web saying, "My mind is like an internet browser. There are 19 open tabs, 3 of them are frozen, and I don't know where the music is coming from." That's pretty on point for us. That description also matches the symptoms of ADD, but many autist minds function in a similar manner. There are different types of thinkers in the world. While some people think in pictures, others might think in patterns. My thought process primarily exists in sounds, words, and concepts. At any given time, in my head, any number of things such as ideas from books, medical knowledge surrounding my career, theological concepts, philosophical principles, and many more things are all bouncing around in my head at the same time. Meanwhile, that darn music is playing somewhere in the background. Everything bounces around like a million kids jumping on a giant trampoline at the same time. Autistic people are known for having special interests that we obsess about. We're either totally enveloped by something or have no interest in it whatsoever. Our incredibly intense thought process is associated with these obsessions. Since it is so in-depth, we know a lot of information about our favorite topics. We can go on for a long period of time about these topics, highlighting every minuscule detail about things we like until you're so bored that you want to rip your hair out. Lots of young kids and teens on the spectrum are noted for sounding like college professors with doctorate degrees when they tell you about their favorite subjects. There are lots of neurotypicals who don't have nearly as much knowledge about their own favorite subjects just because they don't think about it as hard as we do. Obviously, anyone can think in a likewise manner, but it's something almost all autistic people do, and I would argue that the same can't be said of neurotypicals. I think that our thought process is the reason why so many geniuses who revolutionized their fields, such as Steve Jobs, Michael Jackson, and Albert Einstein, exhibited very strong traits associated with autism. Our ability to hyper-focus on certain topics is why we're so good at whatever we dedicate our time to. One of the most significant areas where our neurodivergency affects us is in the area of socializing and communicating with other people. From the viewpoint of many people, difficulty socializing is the hallmark of autism spectrum disorders. We get shortchanged when it comes to the circuits in the brain that make you good at socializing. In the same way that someone's brain might be built to make them a really good musician and a really bad engineer, our brains are not built for socializing. You're going to be hard-pressed to find a single autistic person who is as skilled with all the complex nuances of verbal and non-verbal socialization as a neurotypical. I've spent my entire life trying to learn social skills, but I still sometimes make social mistakes that a neurotypical might have stopped making in their teen years. I had the honor of meeting Temple Grandin and getting her autograph earlier this year when she spoke at a university here in South Carolina. Despite talking about how social skills were taught when she grew up, I still noticed a lot of quirks in communication during her book signing and during her Q&A session after her speech. To use another example, many also think that Bill Gates seems really quirky in the way that he talks with other people. From my own perspective, even as someone who a lot of people think has a fairly normal level of communication, I still have quirks that show when you really get to know me. Social communication is more complex than a lot of neurotypicals realize. Some of the elements socialization consists of are tone of voice, okay then, versus okay then. Choice of words, I don't care for that movie, versus that movie was awful. Facial expressions, looks you shoot with your eyes, talking with your hands, etc. Any combination or mixture of those elements and nuances of social communication can lead to a variety of different ideas being expressed. You can use the same words and they could mean something entirely different based on the tone of voice and facial expressions. For example, the phrase, "you're an idiot." I laugh, smile, and say, "You're an idiot." Sounds like I'm joking around with someone I like. On the other hand, I glare at someone and say, "You're an idiot," while raising my voice. In that scenario, my tone of voice and facial expression indicate that I'm dishing out a pretty scathing insult. Neurotypicals pick up on these nuances of social communication naturally. They don't have to ask themselves what exactly someone meant when they said something. They can figure it out on their own by the social nuances they see. We don't naturally pick up on those nuances. We have to learn them and do a lot of thinking in order to make sure we are both perceiving other people's communication correctly and expressing ourselves so that we will be perceived in the way that we mean to be. What I said in the last paragraph about different ways to say the same words and communicate different things is common knowledge for most people. Your average person would be surprised at the amount of time it took for me to work out the social signals I just described. With all I've said in mind, you've just arrived at the reason why autistic people are mistaken as being rude when their intent is not. Many of us eventually learn to work inside the framework of all these various nuances of communication so that we can function effectively in the world. Growing up, however, many of us just say what we're thinking without much respect to how a statement is worded, what tone of voice we use, what facial expression we use, and so on. Although it is impossible to communicate socially without there being some kind of tone of voice or facial expression, even a lack thereof/neutral expression, we're not consciously utilizing those nuances or trying to communicate our thoughts in any particular way. Therefore, many of us just narrate our thoughts in the way it is worded, or the tone of voice we use may be interpreted to be rude. Why? An average person without autism utilizes certain cues to express particular things, but we might not even know that we're giving off the same cues that a neurotypical would use to express anger, opposition, defiance, sarcasm, or other things that would lead to being perceived as rude. Many times we just sort of say things and they come out however, and we're not really paying attention to any of those nuances that are meant to help communicate how something is intended. When an autistic person is speaking, they might give off any combination of those nuances even if they don't match the intended meaning of their statement. Since we have to learn these nuances rather than naturally picking them up, that's why we make the social mistakes we do, such as misinterpreting sarcasm or something else non-literal as a literal statement. For example, when I was young, I had some people try to bully me by saying, "You have no life." Obviously, that insult means that you're not doing anything interesting or productive with your life and that the way you spend your time is wasteful. That phrase confused me because I thought that they were literally saying that you have no life, as in you are dead because your body has ceased being alive. I think that makes no sense. Of course I'm alive. I have a pulse, I'm breathing, and I'm talking to you. In the realm of socialization, many of us have difficulty maintaining eye contact. I don't have trouble with eye contact anymore, but the only way I can explain the eye contact problem is by saying that eye contact feels like a very intimate and close encounter with another person. It feels like you're staring right into my soul and you can read everything about me. That's not an experience you'd want to have with a stranger on the street. You'd only want to have it with something that you are well acquainted with. Due to our lack of social insight and second-nature ability to describe our interest in painstaking detail, we might have difficulty having a two-way conversation. We might bombard other people with information about our special interest without regard to their disinterest about that topic, desired reply, or desire to change the subject. We also have difficulty gauging personal space, i.e., how much space to leave between you and another person while you're talking to them. I used to stand too close to other people because I had difficulty understanding what they were saying, and I didn't realize I was making them uncomfortable because I wasn't giving them enough personal space. A stereotype you might hear is that an autistic person is someone who speaks in a monotone voice, always has a neutral facial expression, speaks literally, never using sarcasm or abstract metaphors, says facts with no regard to how they might offend people, such as saying you're overweight, and interprets everything everyone says in a literal manner. This stereotype is true for some autistic people. Parts of that description even matched me at one point in my life. The Netflix TV show Atypical is about an 18-year-old autistic guy named Sam Gardner. The stereotype I just gave matches the character of Sam for the most part. The individuals who created the show, as well as the actor playing Sam, did an incredibly good job of portraying a strongly affected autistic person who exhibits many of those traits. Although an average autist may not be the absolute epitome of all those traits, many of us exhibit and struggle to overcome some of them. Another area where we are all affected is in the area of emotions and regulating our emotions. Most of us really have trouble with emotional regulation. A common theme you'll pick up on among autistic people is that we tend to be either 0% or 100% about everything. A good example of this scenario is what I wrote earlier about being completely enthralled by something or having no interest in it at all. This theme really plays out when it comes to our emotions. I especially identify with this idiosyncrasy. My emotions are either very intense or non-existent. I'm either overjoyed by something or I'm enraged by something. A small positive interaction I have with someone can leave me in a happy state for the rest of the day, or a negative interaction can leave me angry for the rest of the day. Psychologists believe that the reason we have difficulty with emotional regulation is because the circuits in our brain that assist people with that process are lacking in autistic people. If you've ever heard of an autistic meltdown, emotional dysregulation is what's happening when we melt down. Anyone can freak out and have a meltdown, but these episodes are particularly intense and lengthy when it comes to autistic people. A meltdown is like a volcanic eruption. It is a massive discharge of pent-up stress, anger, frustration, and sadness that happens all at one time. Meltdowns are also not the same thing as a tantrum. A child who throws a tantrum usually does it in order to manipulate their parents for selfish reasons. He throws a tantrum because their parents won't get him the new toy on the shelf or won't take him to McDonald's when they were already planning to cook burgers for dinner that night. Meltdowns are not the same thing. A meltdown is a way of saying, I'm overwhelmed, I can't take this anymore, and I've got to get all this frustration out of me. An autistic meltdown is diametrically opposed to a child's petty tantrum. I don't know any autistic people who completely grow out of meltdowns as they mature. We all have them when enough stress builds up. It's like a snowball gaining size and speed as it rolls downhill. Once the snowball culminates into a huge frozen mass, it slams into something in its path and causes a catastrophic avalanche. For me, and I'm not certain if other autistic people experience meltdowns this way, there is a dark twist when it comes to meltdowns. Using the snowball analogy, as soon as the destructive avalanche ends and things become peaceful again, a small amount of snow left over from the disaster forms another tiny snowball. That tiny ball will eventually gain enough snow in order to repeat the process all over again and cause another avalanche. This process of buildup and disaster is exactly how I experience stress, and the cycle will repeat until the day I die. There's always a snowball rolling downhill, even if it's rolling really slowly. My life can run smoothly and be free of significant frustrations for an extended length of time, but even the minor frustrations and annoyances over a long period of time would trigger a meltdown. Going back to the previous analogy, the snowball might be rolling downhill at a snail's pace, but it will eventually collect enough snow to start rolling faster and cause a calamity. It never stops moving, and another one forms immediately after the current one is destroyed. Difficulty with empathy is one of the other prominent areas where we struggle with emotions. Over time, I've found that autistic people can lean either way. Some of us are severely lacking in empathy, while others have excessive empathy. This experience of hyper-empathy may be overwhelming, and some autists may attempt to switch their emotions off in order to avoid feeling overwhelmed. I struggle with having too little empathy. Throughout the majority of my life, I didn't feel anything when I hurt people or made other people feel uncomfortable. I didn't care at all. I only cared about facts and brutal honesty, having no regard for people's feelings or how I might hurt them. Once I did hurt someone's feelings, I only cared about how the aftermath of that situation might affect my life. I dated a girl for 2 years, and dating her helped me develop some empathy. Working in medicine has also helped me with empathy. Even though I'm better than I used to be, I find that my level of empathy still isn't up to par with what neurotypicals experience. I do my best to empathize, and if I can't, I try to sympathize instead. Imagine not feeling any of what other people are feeling, even if you want to. Conversely, imagine feeling so much of other people's emotions that you just can't take it. What I've just asked you to imagine gives you a little snapshot of what some autistic people experience in regard to empathy. Something that we do to help with emotional regulation is called stimming. Stimming refers to repetitive and self-stimulating behaviors. Some common stims among autistic people on both the severely and mildly affected ends of the spectrum are flapping your hands, rocking back and forth, and repeating certain phrases, which is called echolalia. See what I did there? The reason I've always found stimming to be comforting and helpful in emotional regulation is that it helps get a lot of those intense emotions out. Since we have such strong emotions, stims act as an outpouring of that energy. It is a channel through which we can discharge all of those intense feelings and therefore help regulate our emotions. An autistic person who is forced to stop stimming is going to struggle a lot more with regulating their emotions, since it is one of our most important tools to keep our emotions at a healthy level. Although some people find repetitive stims annoying, asking autistic people to stop stimming would be requiring us to suppress a natural behavior that is necessary for autistic people to be as healthy as we can be. Suppressing our stims is synonymous with bottling up and denying our emotions, which is unhealthy for anyone. I've noticed that while stimming is usually associated with autistic people, there are a lot of other neurodivergent people who stim as well. My uncle has a good friend whose son was in a bad car wreck as a baby and received a brain injury. At the time I'm making this video, he is 18 years old. His father said that his mental age and learning capabilities capped out at about the age of an 8-year-old. So short of a revolutionary new treatment for such a brain injury, his mindset is always going to be that of an 8-year-old. Back in 2016, when he was about 15, I met him, his father, and my uncle at a restaurant for dinner. Although not autistic, I got the impression he had a high energy level as well as strong emotions. During the meal, he got up and jumped around next to the table. I commented to his father that people with disabilities seem to have high energy levels and they behave in such ways in order to help quell that energy. While stimming is most commonly associated with autism, we aren't the only ones who stim. I do a lot of stimming myself. I don't jump around at the dinner table since that would be perceived as inappropriate, as I am an adult with adult cognition. I work in the medical field. At the time I make this video, I am working as an EMT in the emergency department, and I am about to start working on an ambulance again. While I'm in a patient's room or working with a patient one-on-one, I can't exhibit stims that come across as strange behavior. It is likely to confuse the patient and make them feel uncomfortable. Making a patient feel bad is the last thing I want to do when they are going through some of the darkest moments of their lives. Instead, I stim when I'm doing something on my own, such as when I'm working in a patient's chart, getting something from one of the storage rooms, stocking supplies in the patient's rooms, or even walking down the hallway by myself. These stims are a lot more minor and less noticeable than what I do at home. I'll bounce my leg while sitting, blink really hard, tense up certain muscles, hum, or quietly talk to myself. When I'm at home by myself, and therefore when it is appropriate, my stims are a lot more intense. I'll yell things out loud, sing, or if I'm thinking about something really hard, I might even jump and run around the room. Those stims might sound excessive, but I simply do what I have to do in order to release that energy and help regulate my emotions. Something I do want to do here is address the concept of tics. Tics are usually associated with Tourette syndrome and consist of involuntary words, sounds, or movements. The person exhibiting tics has little to no control over them. From what I've gathered, the experience of ticking is a lot like someone else taking the driver's seat of your body for the duration of the tic. Tourette syndrome is defined by tics. I've had people ask me before if some of my stims are tics associated with autism. The answer is no. A stim is not necessarily a tic. I have full control over what I do and what I don't do. I simply choose to stim because it is needed for me to be as healthy a person as I can be. However, I believe there are some autistic people who have stims that are also tics. I had an autistic friend growing up who did things I didn't understand. My parents told me that they were involuntary tics and that he didn't have control over them. Looking back, it appears that he was having involuntary stims, which by definition would be tics. Either way, my stims are not tics, and most autistic people I know do not make any kind of claim that they don't have control over their stims. The next part of dealing with autism is issues with sensory processing and difficulty with incoming stimuli. This can take a lot of different forms, but most autistic people have issues with incoming stimuli in one way or another. Any number of incoming stimuli can be uncomfortable, annoying, or downright painful. Autistic sensitivities to stimuli range across all 5 senses. Certain sounds, sights, smells, taste, and tangible sensations can all be potentially distressing. One of the most common sensory problems is problems with clothing. The tags or seams on clothing might be so comfortable to an autistic person that they can't wear it for any length of time without completely losing it and having a meltdown. I didn't wear much than sweatpants and t-shirts until I was an adult because they were soft, stretchy, and therefore the only thing that was comfortable. I had difficulty wearing any type of clothing that was tight or restrictive of movement in any way. As an adult, nice clothes don't bother me, but it is nice to come home, take formal wear off, and put on something comfy. Other things that an autistic person might be sensitive to are bright/flashing lights, loud noises, certain food textures, etc. You can also have difficulty sorting out all kinds of incoming stimuli, which I will explain in a moment. A lot of my sensory sensitivities involve sound. I can't handle kids or babies screaming or crying for any length of time. It is physically painful for me to hear them screaming for even a few seconds. Let me put this in perspective. I worked in a psychiatric hospital for 2 years. I had many situations in which adults were screaming at the top of their lungs while they were right next to me. I could be in that situation for 15 minutes with no problem. I can hardly handle a child screaming from across the room. I have earplugs with me whenever I'm not at home just in case I encounter screaming kids, which working in the ER tends to happen a lot. My other sensitivity with sound is pretty much any loud, prolonged mishmash of noise. I can handle it for a while, but it does end up becoming annoying. It could be a noisy sports bar, someone playing an extremely loud instrument, or the streets of New York City during rush hour. The best way I can describe these sensitivities in such a way that neurotypicals can understand is as follows. Take any incoming stimuli that you wouldn't have a problem with and multiply it times 1,000. Using my personal example, most people think that a crying baby is a minor nuisance. However, imagine that every time you heard a baby cry, you heard the crying at 500 decibels. Imagine that every time you heard that particular sound, you heard it as if you had headphones on with the volume at maximum. That is how autistic people perceive uncomfortable stimuli, and that's why certain stimuli can be painful. For us, whatever incoming stimuli we are sensitive to comes in far stronger than it would for a neurotypical. When it comes to difficulty sorting out incoming stimuli, sound is where I struggle big time. If I'm in a very noisy place, I can have a hard time screening out one sound from another. This usually is an issue if someone's talking to me. They have to be practically yelling with their mouth right next to my ear in order for me to understand them. I can't filter out all the other background noise and differentiate the incoming sound of the place we're in from the incoming sound of the person's voice. It all runs together for me like a collage or several colors being mixed into a single different color. This is also an issue when it comes to understanding what people say. I have a hard time understanding what someone is saying unless they speak clearly, at a reasonable volume, and with proper enunciation. For that reason, I have a hard time understanding people with strong accents who do not pronounce English words as Americans or British people would, and I have an even harder time understanding people with speech impediments. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand patients with speech impediments, but it all just sounds like gibberish to me. If you say a phrase loudly and clearly, I'll understand it. You can say the same phrase at the same volume while mumbling, and I can't catch a single word. I'm not hard of hearing as someone would mistake me to be. My eardrums are not failing to work as I can hear the sound waves perfectly, I just can't make out what those sounds mean. In other words, I can hear you loud, I just can't hear you clear. Everyone relies on their brain to relay information to them correctly. Any number of medical issues such as dementia, strokes, and schizophrenia can impair the brain's ability to relay correct information to you so that you know what's going on. When I have trouble distinguishing speech, my ears are fine, but my brain isn't telling me the right information. Those are some of my particular sensory issues. If you do enough research, you'll discover that across the autistic spectrum, there are a wide variety of sensitivity to stimuli in all 5 senses. What I've covered in this relatively short video is my best attempt to explain what it's like to be autistic. Every autistic person has their own experience, so I can't speak for everyone, but I've tried to address commonalities that all or most autistic people can relate to. I hope that it's been insightful and that you've learned something from my explanation. Thank you for your time, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.